is Union Matters with Nicholas Thompson. Please welcome social justice advocate Nicholas Thompson.
Good evening. Welcome to Union Matters. I'm your host, Nicholas Thompson. I want to begin tonight's broadcast by honoring Mother Africa, mother of all people, recognizing the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade and the people's call for reparations. And that we are also here on the unceded territory that belonged and belongs to the indigenous, Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people, long before colonial powers arrived and named it Canada. Please, as you're joining us, hit the share button so that we can get as many people as possible to join the event. Also, like our page to support Union Matters. Friends, today we're celebrating International Workers' Day, which is to recognize workers' rights. And, it's a very challenging day because we cannot celebrate when workers are dying, deaths which are completely preventable. In Ontario and across Ontario, we've had over 24,000 people that have died from COVID-19. Many of these deaths were preventable. Workers are not getting access to vaccines and do not have access to proper paid sick leave. There's a new development on the sick leave, which I will get into shortly tonight. So tonight, we are talking about a life-saving measure, paid sick leave, a basic human right. Our panelists include the Member of Parliament for the Member of Provincial Parliament for Toronto St. Paul's, Dr. Jill Andrew.
Hello.
Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Next, we have Patty Coates. She's the president of the Ontario Federation of Labour. Her organization represents over 1 million workers in Ontario.
Hello.
Welcome. One of those workers, a grocery store clerk, Rashiv Brown, is also joining our panel discussion. Welcome, Rashiv.
Thank you. Welcome. Thank you for having me.
Grocery store workers are essential frontline workers and were hailed as heroes by the government. Next, we have Professor Anna Ainsworth, who teaches politics at Seneca College. Welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Thank you. And finally, we're talking with Julius Arscott. He is a presidential candidate for the Canadian Labour Congress elections.
Yes, thank you, Nicholas. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you very much. Friends, before we get into the discussion, I want to take a few minutes just to talk quickly about equity within the public service. Let's watch this short clip and we'll be right back.
We have a breaking story to tell you about this hour. CBC News has learned that Black members of the civil service, the Canadian Public Service, both current and former members, have launched a lawsuit against the government, alleging decades of discrimination that kept them from advancing in their careers.
The suit aims to represent tens of thousands of employees alleging decades of anti-Black discrimination.
The class action lawsuit alleges systemic discrimination toward Black public employees, specifically that they faced discrimination in the hiring process and when up for promotions dating back to the 1970s.
A group of Black civil servants is turning to the courts to address their claims of discrimination against the federal government. The current and former civil servants have issued a proposed $900 million class action lawsuit against the federal government, alleging it discriminated against Black employees for decades. The proposed claim maintains the government excluded Black federal employees from being promoted. And Lucy, make no mistake, this is a major development, a significant, a landmark case, $900 million that has implications for organizations and institutions across the country.
The first part of this action is to address damages. If you acknowledge that Blacks are being oppressed, if you acknowledge that these damages are there, then the first thing is to compensate black workers for these damages. And then secondly, to address the future, we need to create systems to prevent those damages from continuing. We need to address that by ensuring that our public service is reflective of the Canadians that we serve.
Friends, since the launch of the Black Class Action last December, over 700 workers have signed up with almost 15,000 signing our petition. Some unions and associations have pledged support, and I want to acknowledge the support of the Public Service Alliance of Canada. However, the level of support, of union support for Black workers, is by far deeply disappointing. Unions should be leading this fight, not injured workers. Black workers are before the courts fighting for their lives because unions failed to represent them. They failed in their duty to represent Black workers, which allowed the government to carry on systemic discrimination for decades. So why do Black workers now have to beg unions for financial support for the legal action? Unions must come on board and fully support Black workers, beginning at the top of the House of Labour, the Canadian Labour Congress. The Congress under Hassan Youssef has refused to support Black workers, yet endorsing Bill Morneau for the OECD, and supported farm workers as far as India, which, by the way, is very commendable. But why not support Black workers right here in Canada? Dues-paying workers that fund the Canadian Labour Congress. The Congress is scheduled for elections in June 2021, and I invited the presidential candidates to state their position on equity in the labor movement and whether they will support Black workers. Team Unite CLC declined the invitation. We also requested a statement to share with you that went unanswered. We provided an invitation as well to the other slate that we're aware of, which is Labour Forward. And Julius Arscott, the presidential candidate for that slate, is joining us this evening. Welcome, Julius.
Hi, thank you, Nicholas. Thank you very much for the invitation, and happy International Workers' Day.
Thank you very much. So, Julius, I'm not going to mix any matters here. I'm going to get right down to it. If you become the president of the Canadian Labour Congress, will you support Black workers? And what is your slate's plan for diversifying the labor movement?
That's a great question, and it's certainly a question that's at the heart of many issues affecting the labor movement in Canada today. First, I think it's important to acknowledge that systemic racism exists in society, and it exists in the labor movement, and that is just a fact. I think that an important approach that the labor leadership and frankly the rank and file need to take is that we need to believe workers of color, Black workers, when they raise awareness or complain about racism and harassment in the workplace and in the union. We have, I think as a society, we have learned to do that when women complain about or bring awareness to sexual harassment or discrimination. And so I think that that same approach needs to be adopted towards workers of color. One of our candidates, Sandra Griffith Bonaparte, has been dealing with an egregious situation. She was and still is now is a leader within her division. It's the UNDE, which is the Union of National Defense Employees, which is a component of PSAC. She faced horrible racism from bigots within her own division, who brought her forward to a meeting that was organized of local presidents within her division, where many people berated her and attacked her. And then when she refused to acknowledge these attacks, pressed charges against her and had her removed from office, which was just absolutely disgusting. Sandra challenged that and eventually came out on the victorious side. She's part of our slate. I'm very proud to be part of a slate with Sandra and and also Sister Jenny Esnard. This is an ongoing issue, and as a white man, I can't really. I think I have a feeling of what this might feel like, but the dismissal that Black workers feel from the employers, from union leadership, being berated, being told how they should behave, what's appropriate in terms of how Black workers should react to systemic racism is totally unacceptable. And it needs to be challenged on all levels. In the workplace with the employer, at the local level, unions, provincial bodies such as the Ontario Federation of Labour and the Canadian Labour Congress. And I think that an important step towards this is education, which is happening. It's starting. It needs to ramp up. But also, if elected, and I will say that, and I just want to bring attention to the fact that our slate, the Labour Forward slate, is a diverse slate. It is the diverse slate. 2/3 are women and 2/3 are workers of color. We believe that we need to fight against two-tier concessionary bargaining. Two-tier bargaining disproportionately impacts young workers, women, and workers of color who suffer through poor wages, worse benefits, and also attacks on pension. Sometimes through two-tier, they don't have a pension. And so this, I think, is something that is important, that needs to be talked about and promoted at the national level. And lastly, Nicholas, and tell me if I'm running on too long.
Go ahead.
I think that, Black Lives Matter has shown us, it has tangibly demonstrated the power of mass action, unlike anything that we've seen in a generation. In fact, the demonstrations in support of Black Lives Matter in the United States were the largest demonstrations in the history of the United States. And we have gone from a period a year ago where Black Lives Matter activists were targeted as and labeled as terrorists to the biggest corporations in the United States identifying with Black Lives Matter. I'm sure that there are police stations that have BLM written on their cars. The power is with the people, and when the people mobilize, we can move mountains. And the labor movement has a lot to learn from Black Lives Matter. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about that, maybe if you have a few questions, a Q&A. But I think that we're at a very important time where a lot is possible, but we have to make a concerted effort to make these changes, to take systemic racism seriously and not rely on tokenism so much as fostering and building up people and defending Black workers in particular who face systemic racism more than any other group.
So tell us, I'm interested to know, what you'll do differently to address these issues that you've so well put, that exist, these barriers that exist, that Black workers can't even express themselves, that the colonial system built into the unions, can easily be used to suppress and oppress Black folks.
Yeah, so as an officer of the Canadian Labour Congress, when we win the executive of the CLC, we will have the power of influence, meaning that we will have the forum of the labor movement across the country to bring attention to these issues, to focus on specific campaigns such as your campaign, Nicholas, to bring awareness to it, to say this type of behavior is not acceptable. It is not acceptable. We would not be delayed in supporting initiatives like Land Back or Black Lives Matter. And we would focus on being at the forefront of every one of these struggles. Every time an equity-seeking group launches a campaign publicly, we would be there to support them. Now, being in that position, President of the Canadian Labour Congress, I can't force anybody to do anything, but I can certainly promote the idea. I can assign staff to promote and campaign on these ideas. I would focus and shift the CLC resources towards fighting these and launching these campaigns and promoting them coast to coast to coast. And that's the power of being a leader, really, at the CLC or at the provincial level.
Thank you very much. Julius, I want to thank you for, we'll bring you back on. Thank you. How much time? How much time? We'll be right back.
What is it you wanted me to reconcile myself to? I was born here almost 60 years ago. I'm not going to live another 60 years. You always told me it takes time. It has taken my father's time, my mother's time, my uncle's time, my brother's and my sister's time, my nieces and my nephew's time. How much time do you want for your progress?
How much time do you want for your progress? Friends, after 15 years in power, the provincial Liberal government enacted 2 paid sick leave days for every worker, and that was in 2017. In 2018, the Conservative government cancelled a measure, leaving workers with no minimum standards of paid sick leave. When the global pandemic, COVID-19 came, it highlighted the need more than ever for paid sick leave. The government's own advisory table called for paid sick leave, alongside doctors, unions, and of course, members of provincial parliament and many others. The response of the Ford government was to call on the federal government to do the work that that has provincial jurisdiction. The feds responded exactly that and called on the province to provide paid sick leave. Premier Doug Ford told Ontario that his government will launch the best sick leave program in, is it North America? Yes, North America. And, you know, we're here today. 3 paid sick leave, which we don't know when that will come into effect, but that's what has been put forward. Ontario's official opposition, the NDP, presented several motions and I believe 2 bills for paid sick leave, and those bills were defeated. The Liberals also presented a bill recently for sick leave, which was defeated. The government continued to refuse to follow the advice of its science advisory table. And after 13 long months of COVID-19 and being in the 3rd wave, the provincial government brought forward legislation to have 3 paid sick leave. So let's begin with Rashiv Brown, and he's a frontline worker. And you know, I want to hear from workers. Tell me, Rashiv, how are you going to, you know, how will 3 days sick leave benefit you if you become ill or come into some contact with someone who has COVID-19 and you have to self-isolate for 14 days?
First of all, I want to say thank you for having me. And second of all, I just want to say it doesn't really help. It doesn't really help work as much. Interestingly enough, when this came into effect, my coworkers are aware of the advocacy that I do. So right away they started asking me questions, and I started pointing out to them like 3 paid sick days, up to $200 a day is not much, especially in COVID-19, where you need to self-isolate for 14 days. So one day you go and get your test, you're not being paid for that day. You get while you wait for your result, you're not being paid. So that could take probably up to, I don't know, in total 17 days, right? So having 3 days where you actually get paid is not much if you're looking to stay home for 14 days. And that 14 days, that 2 weeks, for a lot of workers, it's their rent, it's their food, it's them taking care of their kids. So 3 paid sick days doesn't really go much, especially in a global pandemic where you need 2 weeks to isolate. So it is definitely not the best paid sick days plan in North America.
So let me ask you this then. You have 3 paid sick leave, 3 paid days, right? You have to quarantine. You've used the 3 days. Then what happens after that? What do you do?
Nothing. You quarantine without pay. So it's almost like.
So how would you provide for your family and during that time?
That is the question. Like, and maybe that's what the premier is not aware of. Maybe you need to be a working class person. Maybe you need to be a frontline worker to understand why the legislation doesn't go far enough. Maybe Ford need, instead of having these conversations with these specialists, maybe he should actually be doing surveys, asking the working class people, asking the essential workers, what would paid sick days look like for them, instead of implementing a plan that doesn't really do much for us, but it's coming from above. It's not really coming from what we would like to see. It's coming from what he thinks is best, which is not best for us.
Let me ask you this, because let's talk about that for a little bit. The premier recently had to self-isolate himself, and your taxpayers' dollars was able to provide him with proper sick leave, and he was paid for the full time during his self-isolation. How does that make you feel as a frontline worker who, with 3 days paid sick leave?
Man, it makes me feel horrible. It makes me feel horrible, but at the same time, it gives me the motivation I need to keep doing the work that I do, to keep fighting, to keep trying to mobilize my workplace and other workers, right? It's such an uphill battle, but we gotta keep going, right? We gotta keep mobilizing. At the end of the day, 3 days doesn't go far enough, but it's a small victory. So we need to keep the fire on his feet. I did a recent interview on CBC where I blatantly said, hey, Ford, like, let's not make this an election issue. Because if this becomes an election issue, and most likely COVID's not going anywhere and they failed so much with the vaccination plan, that this issue might actually become an election issue. And he's not going to get reelected. Definitely not. So he has a chance now to save lives with just a signature. He has a chance now to make it not go forward to become an election issue where he's not going to get reelected. So.
And that's, I think, very important. If you could tell the premier now about sick leave, what would you tell him? How much would you tell him would be suitable for workers?
I think minimum of 10 days, like normally. 14 days on a global pandemic would be amazing. I mean, we all know that we have to self-isolate for 14 days in COVID. So I would like to see 10, permanent days, and then 14 days in a global pandemic, right? I mean, it's taxpayers' money, and we're not even asking the government to pay it. We're asking for employer paid sick days. These 3 days that he implemented, the employers actually getting reimbursed for those. So it doesn't make any sense.
Right. And I'll come back to you in a little bit. Thank you very much. So that was Rashiv, a frontline worker. He says 10 paid sick leave permanently. And during the pandemic, we should have 14 days as a temporary measure, because that's the amount of time that it takes workers, it takes you to quarantine. Thank you very much, Rashiv, for that, for your insights there. I'm going to bring on Dr. Jill Andrew. She's the provincial member of Parliament for Toronto St. Paul's. Dr. Andrew, your party tabled several actions for paid sick leave in the legislature, which was all defeated. Can you tell us a little bit about those efforts? You're on mute.
Oh dear. Oh, I thought you had to unmute me. Am I still, can you hear me?
Perfect, go ahead.
You can hear me? Excellent. First of all, I want to say thank you, Nicholas, for inviting me. And yes, the Ford government has said no to paid sick days, paid sick leave, I believe 26 times in the Legislative Assembly of Ontario. I want to make it clear that my colleague MPP Peggy Sattler put forth legislation calling for paid sick days. Her bill was called Stay at Home If You're Sick Act. This bill was tabled, it was introduced in December of 2020. You know, I think of all the lives that could have been saved if the government had listened, not only to the opposition, but listened to science, listened to the modeling that was demonstrating that had he not taken swift action to protect our essential workers, that he would be walking us in, dragging us in to a third wave of this pandemic with variants that are getting people sick and frankly killing them faster than before. Instead, what we have is a premier who spent over a year, Nicholas, watching nearly 500,000 people get infected with COVID-19. 8,000 or something like that die of COVID-19. All of this has happened, you know, while workers have had to struggle with eviction notices, you know, while workers have had to get onto crammed streetcars and buses and trains to get to the essential job that they don't have the luxury of working at home from to take care of their kids, while many of our workers live in intergenerational homes. And I have to make it clear that, in my opinion, Doug Ford's ignoring of these experts, doctors, essential workers, unions, everyone, quite frankly, across Ontario, his ignoring of this call for paid sick days and for paid sick leave for a real program here in Ontario, it is anti-Black racism, point blank. It is classism at its finest, and it is sexism. And I'm going to tell you why. The majority of the essential workers, Nicholas, who are going out into jobs that they have no choice to go in, no choice but to go into, in warehouses, in factories, essential jobs, they look like you and I. They are racialized folks. They are Black folks. They are folks with lower income, right? So what does it say when the government does not want to protect these heroes? What does it say about a government like that? What does it say about a government where predominantly women are on our front lines, our healthcare front lines, PSWs? You know what I mean? And the government will not legislate Bill 239, paid sick leave, paid sick days, to ensure that folks can have a permanent paid sick day plan in Ontario, plus the 14 days that they need to be able to be at home quarantined without worrying about the food, the rent, the school supplies for the children, you know, the public transit fee. This is inhumane and it is callous, especially, you know, when the premier had to self-quarantine himself. I thought, is this going to be one of those moments where, you know, faced with his own possible mortality, he might wake up? And Reshev, I have to say, you know, it's not that Doug Ford doesn't know. He knows exactly what he's doing. He has chosen not to care. He has chosen to abdicate his responsibilities onto the federal government, knowing fully well that the federal program, the paid sick day program they have, is not adequate either. We need a program here in Ontario. The government can make a program here in Ontario work. He has been able to self-quarantine at something like $800 a day, paid. And I've made it clear in the legislature, every single MPP has paid sick days, paid leave. We do not lose a penny to get our vaccine. But this government has created a social condition where the people who need the help the most in our gravest hour, they're left with 3 days, measly 3 days. And you know, Nicholas, You were right to mention about the Liberals initially. Over 15 years, the Liberals provided 2 days. So one could argue even worse than what Doug Ford is providing. We have to also remember that the problem we're seeing in long-term care, the problem we're seeing in healthcare, all of the fissures and cracks in our healthcare system, they did not develop with COVID-19 alone. They were there with SARS. They were there. PSWs, frontline healthcare workers, have been screaming at the top of their lungs. We are under-resourced. We are understaffed. Healthcare isn't being funded to inflation. All of this stuff has been happening. You know, laboratories aren't getting the kind of funding they need to be kept up to snuff. You know, recommendations, emergency measurement recommendations, you know, sat on a table and got dust in the previous Liberal government. So I say all of this to say that where we are today on May 1st, International Workers' Day, isn't by accident. It was created by design. And the design is one that keeps racialized Black women, injured workers, lower income families, single parents, people with disabilities, I can go on, it keeps them down. And the buck has to stop now. We will not stop fighting because we know the 3-day sick days is not enough. Experts, doctors, ICU physicians crying at work have said this 3 days is not enough. It will not contain the spread. In fact, the science table has been clear. Get more vaccines to hotspots. Where are the vaccines? Where was the equity strategy to ensure that the vaccines got to the communities that needed them the most, first and foremost? Where was the strategy to ensure that workplaces that were non-essential were shut down immediately and that workers were supported working from home? You know, where was the funding for our small businesses to ensure that they could survive, they could shut down and not have to worry about being evicted? And these are things that we asked for from last year, spring, Nicholas. Eviction ban, commercial and housing, you know? Direct funding for individual, for Black entrepreneurs, for small business owners that we know systemically outside of COVID. Look at what's happening in Little Jamaica right now. Outside of COVID, people who systemically have always gotten the shorter end of the stick, we know needed supports, and they have not gotten those supports. And workers need time off to get their vaccination. Let me tell you, I had a COVID scare, Nicholas. I had to isolate. I took 2 COVID tests, which on both occasions, it took roughly 2 days to get the results for. All of that, and I didn't lose a penny. I am no better than any Ontarian. And Doug Ford sure as heck is no better than any Ontarian. So if it is good enough for legislators, it must be good enough for workers.
That's let me ask you this, and you probably don't have to answer it, but if your party forms the next provincial government next year, we're scheduled for an election. What will your party implement?
What will our party implement? We will implement legislation that will respect and protect and pay workers. You know, let's talk about PSWs first of all. Let's talk about the way in which PSWs are underpaid, right? We have demanded a $5 bump to the minimum salary of PSWs, and that should be permanent. You know, that should be permanent. You know, we need to ensure that PSWs and other frontline healthcare workers have access to well-paid full-time jobs, because when the job is precarious, we lose an entire sector of workers, because guess what, Nicholas? They're not going to pursue the career in post-secondary if they're hearing that the job doesn't come with the fruitfulness, the security, the stability that they need. We would absolutely legislate permanent paid sick days, Plus, of course, we don't know when this pandemic is ending. So we strongly believe, and we have put forth legislation calling for those extra 14 pandemic days. So this is part of what we believe in. You know, we would ensure that frontline healthcare workers receive the training that they need, that new people coming into the field receive the training that they need. You know, we would ensure that our healthcare system, along with other institutions that are broken by design, are properly funded. So people can not just survive. Who wants to just exist in a world where all you're doing is surviving? You want to thrive at some point. You want to be able to thrive. And we would absolutely legislate a livable wage. You know, like these are fundamental, basic human rights. This is not asking for milk and honey. This is literally asking for respect and protection and to be paid for what you are worth for the job that you are doing. And the government now has failed. They have failed miserably. You know, I will never forget talking to a PSW. Never. And I've spoken to hundreds. And being told that they were not being provided the PPE that they needed. This is something that would have never happened under an NDP government. You know how many of us, Nicholas, stood up in that house, in the legislature, literally crying. I can speak for myself, crying, begging to ensure that the long-term care homes here in St. Paul's had the PPE they needed so that nobody had to be told by a manager, you know, sorry, but you got to wear that mask for your whole shift. You got to wear that mask in one room that may have infection and in another room that may not. This is inhumane and it is callous. And this is the situation that has caused our ICUs to be ballooning out of control, under-resourced. Doctors fearing that they're going to have to get to a place of triage where they have to start deciding who lives and who dies. None of this had to be this way, and it wouldn't have been this way if Doug Ford had taken his ego and politics out of the game and legislated our paid sick day bill that came out last year. Think about how many lives could have been saved. Last year, right? It is frustrating, it is angering, it is insulting, quite frankly, to those essential workers who he stands up on that podium and calls healthcare heroes. You should see them at Queen's Park. Every time we ask them the question about paid sick days, oh, the federal program, right? So are you not driving the bus right now in Ontario, Doug Ford? Mm-hmm. Are you not the one at the steering wheel? Have you abdicated the steering wheel? Is the bus driving itself? Is what I want to know. You know, if you're going to call essential workers healthcare heroes, we need to ensure that these healthcare workers, these essential workers, our cashiers, our teachers, our education workers, our librarians, I can go on and on and on, are protected and treated like the essential workers that they are.
Let me ask you this. Under your plan, who would pay for it?
Under our plan, it was the employers. Under our plan, it would be accessed through employers. It would be claimed from the first day you're sick. Unlike the federal program where you kind of have to apply online and wait and see and lose 50% of your first week of pay and all these glitches that make it difficult to access right away, right? Not to mention that you would lose significant income. You lose significant income with the federal program. With Peggy's bill, with our plan, you are not going to be losing any income, right? And I have to say, I just want to say this, because I noticed that a lot of people are saying, well, you know, 3 days, it's a start. Guess what? Anything from zero is a start, right? But let's also remember that this is until September. Right. This is until September. I have about 9, maybe 11 friends now, chosen family, who have contracted COVID-19. Some have healed, some did not, right? And I can tell you, from those who have healed, they are still, some of them, dealing with the physical, mental, sensory consequences of COVID-19. September is practically tomorrow, Nicholas. September is practically tomorrow. Before you blink, it'll be September. So again, the government needs to follow science and research, not their political friends, not their lobbyists.
What would you say to, under your plan, the mom and shop family business, how would they afford to pay that amount of sick leave? Like, what would there be any type of help for those types of small businesses?
Well, you know what, Nicholas? I may not have all of the pieces figured out, but what I can tell you is this. Under our Save the Main Street plan, that was introduced again last spring, last summer, and the government said no, it came with rent relief. It came with utility freezes. It came with a ban on evictions. It came with direct financial support for our businesses. And I want to make it clear, when the Jeff Bezos of the world are making billions and billions and billions of dollars during COVID, right? Trust me, the mom and pops by me on Eglinton, the mom and pops on St. Clair West, these mom and pops aren't making billions and billions and billions of dollars. They simply are not. You saw in the first wave, you saw in the second wave, the stores that were allowed to be opened.
Right.
We saw the ones that were allowed to be open. We saw the ones that were not. It is clear that we are dealing with a government that really likes to protect those that have a lot of cheese, that have a lot of, teeth, so to speak, right? A lot of dog in the fight, right? But what about the small mom and pops? What about, and I have to tell you this, even small businesses have supported the call for paid sick days because nobody wants their employees coming in sick because they're afraid of losing income. Nobody wants their employees to interact with one another or with their customers, right? This is not what anyone wants. The Ontario Science Table doesn't want it. The doctors, the experts, none of them want it. But when you do the math and you look back at history and you see, and this shocked me personally, because as you know, Nicholas, I've only been in politics since 2018. So a lot of the damage that has happened with long-term care, the damage that has happened in our school system with our decrepit, disrepair in the billions of dollars with this government and the previous government, all of these things started well before I came, right? But, a figure that I will leave you with, when I looked at the for-profit long-term care system and the nonprofit, right? When we realize that both the Liberal and Conservative governments from about 2007 through 16 have profited. They've received hundreds of thousands of dollars in donations from for-profit long-term care that will hire cheaper frontline healthcare staff, right? And you get what you pay for. They're understaffed, they're under-resourced, they may or may not be undertrained. They're working in a number of LTC homes. They might be working in rooms with more than one patient. This is how the government has contributed to the demise of long-term care, to the demise of healthcare. And this is why we're seeing the pandemic hit us so hard at this time. We have to get profit out of healthcare. We have to get profit out of long-term care. We have to put people first. That is how we ensure that we build the Ontario we wish to see.
We have to put people first. Thank you very much, Dr. Andrew, for sharing with us this evening. I'm going to bring on President Patty Coates from the Ontario Federation of Labour. And Labour has long been calling on the government for paid sick leave. Sister Coates, tell us your position and how will workers benefit? Like, what's happening? What is the OFL working on? Welcome.
Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you for having me here. And I really appreciate the opportunity to speak, but I also really appreciate the opportunity to listen to Rashab, to listen to Dr. Jill Andrews. I think it's important to listen to those that have the lived experiences. And the one thing that I want to also say that, with governments, when they decide on a policy or a bill, they need to be asking themselves two questions. And the first question is, who is this going to help? And the second question is, who are they going to leave behind? And that is really important with ensuring that no one gets left behind. So I want to be really clear about what paid sick days really are and what we have been demanding and pushing for now and for the past many, many, many years. So in the labor movement and with worker advocates, we've been pushing for sick days that are permanent. So they must be legislated and embedded in our Provincial Employment Standards Act. And they cannot be a temporary stopgap measure like the federal Canadian Recovery Sick Benefit or the new Ontario Worker Income Protection Benefit, because they expire. They have an expiry date. They must be adequate. And so, as others have said, at least 10 permanent paid sick days now and beyond, because we want them to remain permanent. And then when there's a pandemic, an additional 14 days so that workers can quarantine and do what they need to do to keep themselves safe, their families safe, and their workplace safe. They must be accessible. One clearly defined program that is seamless and barrier-free, where workers do not have to worry about losing wages or making the difficult decision to go to work sick just to put food on the table and a roof over their heads. We don't want a patchwork of programs with gaping holes that leave out groups of workers like we have now. And that goes back to what I said about when there's a bill, when there's policy development, you need to ask those two very important questions. And of course, we have been advocating that they must be employer paid during this pandemic. We've seen these big corporations like Amazon and Walmart and others who have profited from this pandemic, yet they don't provide paid sick days or quarantine pay for their workers. And with this new program that this government, the Ontario government, has put forward, it actually it rewards those companies like Amazon and Walmart who have made profits by allowing them to use this program to pay their workers for paid sick days. But if there was a small business, and there are many small businesses that already provide paid sick days, they cannot access that program. So, the program needs to be fair for everyone. And these permanent paid sick days must be universally available to every single worker, including part-time, temporary workers, and misclassified workers like gig workers. And any program, like I said, it cannot leave any worker behind, no one. And, as the others have said, we know that it's not just the OFL, it's unions, the labor movement, it is numerous worker advocates, Workers' Action Centre, the Decent Work and Health Network, Ontario Medical Association, the Science Table, doctors, nurses, mayors, and even the Chamber of Commerce that have been pushing for permanent paid sick days. And as Jill also said, we can't forget the official opposition party, because they've also been outspoken. And as she said, this Ford government and the Conservative MPPs have voted against bills and motions calling for paid sick days almost 25, 26 times. And, it just gets my blood boiling when I hear Ford stand at the microphone. He did this a couple of weeks ago, and he preached that we are playing politics, advocating for paid sick days. yet his inactions and voting down those motions and bills again and again and again, he's the one that's playing politics. And the only reason that he is getting or has put into place these 3 temporary paid sick days is because he was relying on the federal government to provide some relief, and they said, we won't give you any further relief unless you institute paid sick days. And so that's why he did it, because he was pushed to do it that way and pushed by us. You know, I just want to put these numbers out here. So we recently commissioned a poll by the communications firm Stratcom, which surveyed a diverse group of Ontarians, over 3,000 Ontario residents aged 18 and over. And the poll found that 83% of Ontarians believe that governments should make all employers provide paid sick days for all employees. Now, we know that during this 3rd wave, it has just been, horrendous. And there's been that urgent need to legislate paid sick days. And what the poll also showed is that the support for paid sick days was especially prominent in hotspot areas, including Toronto, which had the highest support at 89%, followed by parts of Eastern Ontario and the GTA. And they also found that many said that the pandemic has exposed existing social inequities and issues across Ontario. And 77% of them said they were very concerned or somewhat concerned with income inequality. And 50% of Ontarians said that the province needs to make major changes to current policies. So, those are some of the numbers. I have, a few other numbers as well that we can talk about later. But some of the things that we are doing at the OFL, we of course launched campaigns, but our latest campaign is one that was launched just before the day of mourning, which was Thursday, April 28th. Of course, it's a day we remember the workers killed or injured on the job. And this year, it's it was more poignant to remember all of the workers that we lost because of COVID. But we also commit to continuing the fight for laws that improve worker health and safety across the province, and that includes permanent paid sick days. So, as we reflect on the workers who died or fell ill, we also put forward some recommendations that we put to Premier Doug Ford, and we kind of made an ultimatum. So for this campaign, we've set up a tool where you can put in your postal code. The tool generates a templated letter that goes to Ford and your local MPP, and you can find that on the OFL website. And it's calling on our provincial leaders to immediately legislate permanent paid sick days for all workers, to provide the highest quality and amount of personal protective equipment to all workers, because we know that failed miserably throughout the pandemic. Vaccinate equitably and strategically, starting with frontline workers and impacted communities, and ensure that all workers are covered by the workers' compensation system, and legislate and enforce preventative training standards. Of course, demanding protection for all Ontario workers. And you can also follow us on all of the social media platforms to see the various tools that we have, the campaigns that we have ongoing. We supported Peggy Sattler's bill on paid sick days, and we will continue to push and fight for paid sick days until we get the permanent paid sick days that workers deserve.
Thank you very much, Sister Patty. That was very insightful, and I want to thank you for all the work that OFL is doing to combat and to fight for workers' rights, and to the sick leave is really, it's a basic human right that all workers should have. So I want to thank you for that work under your leadership. Next, I'm going to bring on Professor Anna Ainsworth.
Hello. So when I was asked to talk about the subject, I thought maybe I would take an academic approach, but instead I'm going to take a rage approach. I'm going to talk about the fundamental rage that I feel about the fact that this government is literally killing us, literally, through its policy. And Dr. Jill Andrews has elucidated those policies very well, so I don't need to repeat them. I feel incredible rage. This government is killing us, and it is fundamentally a failure of policy. Recently, in the most recent news conference, this government blamed our international students for bringing COVID to us and the new strains. Our international students subsidize all of our domestic students because this government has underfunded not this government, but subsequent governments over 30 years have underfunded every single public sector, including mine, which is colleges. They have underfunded. So we have gone to demanding effectively and recruiting is what we use the language that international students come to us. And now it is blaming for bringing this. The racism is so deeply embedded that it really cannot be spoken in some ways. I had COVID a year ago. I was not eligible because I can work from home as a professor. I was sick for 5 weeks, and then it took me 7 weeks to recover my lung capacity. And I'm fairly young. This is so intolerable. This government is intolerable. And what has come before is also intolerable. We need dramatic change. We need to change in every way. Neoliberalism and corporate masters are intolerable. They do not serve the people. This government is literally killing us. And I think I need to stop there because I am as angry as Dr. Jill. And so I will speak more if I speak more.
Thank you very much. I know you teach political studies at Seneca College, and I'm just intrigued, Anna, because everyone is saying the same thing, which is provide proper paid sick leave for workers so that they could self-isolate or quarantine instead of going to work and spreading the virus. So I'm intrigued from you teach this type of thing. So why is the government not listening to its own advisory table or ordinary folks? Why is there such a huge disconnect?
So in my opinion, the disconnect comes from fundamentally the neoliberal economy. The fact that this government was elected on no platform and was elected on a very populist platform. And populism sells. But populism is dangerous. Populism is not based on principles. It is a shadow cover. And behind populism live other things. I studied genocide as my profession. And so I have had many opportunities to talk to people who have experienced genocide. And populism is one of the foundations of it. There are many others, of course. That this government was elected on no platform was, I think, in my opinion, a foundation of a few things. There were some problems with the previous government. The only alternative within the first past the post system are really three. We don't have a system that actually represents us. And when you only have three options, you have to make a choice. So you choose the one that you think is most reflective of your vision. A government that has no vision is a government that is corrupt fundamentally from the start. And I regret how angry I sound because I am this angry. This is how angry I am, because people are dying because of this government's decisions and because this government is subject to corporate power, not to the people, not to us. This government does not care for us. It never has. Its platform was $1 beer a day. That was its platform. I think that's the best answer I can give you at the moment because I'm too angry to give any better answer. I could give a better answer.
I'll bring on Dr. Andrew. I couldn't help but seeing you applauded in the background there. Did you have a response to what Professor Ainsworth had to say?
I absolutely do. Professor Ainsworth has hit the nail on the head. When we have a conservative Toronto mayor, we all know this, Mayor Tory was once a leader of the Conservative Party, calling for paid sick days. When you have a conservative mayor, Patrick Brown, calling for paid sick days. You've got Bonnie Crombie calling for paid sick days. You've got all of these experts, the science table, calling for paid sick days. And you have a government who fundamentally says no when there is science backing this. Not only quantitative science to get a little academic, but qualitative research. The stories that we bring into Queen's Park every day. That little young 13-year-old girl in Brampton who lost her life, for goodness sakes. And we have a government that says no to one of the foundational ways that we can clamp down on this pandemic and the variants that are running amok in many communities across our province. The government's choices are killing Ontarians. It's that simple. It really is. And I need to break it down further. As I said earlier on, when you spoke to me first, or when you spoke to me in the first cycle, Nicholas, we cannot ignore, and I want everybody listening to remember this. The people that are most disproportionately impacted by Doug Ford and his caucus's decisions, they are Black.
Yes.
They are
Absolutely.
Racialized.
Yep.
They are women, right? They are the folks who are lower income.
Yeah.
They are, as Patty said, the gig economy workers, the misclassified workers, are artists,
Mm-hmm.
The Minister of Culture will stand up and she will yell about how wonderful our culture sector is in Ontario, and it absolutely is. I'm the culture critic, I know. Well, why not care about how those individual artists are making or not making, more realistically, a living during this pandemic? So at every turn, and I have to say this, while COVID-19 is the big elephant in the room, it's the big thing that we're all talking about. Look at the choices that the government has made around housing. Putting forth a Bill 184, that literally made it easier for landlords to evict and toss people out onto the streets during a pandemic when the message is stay at home, right? Look at the fact that after a 3-day cabinet meeting, whatever it was that happened about a week or two ago, the government went away with his ministers and they had a cabinet meeting because they had an announcement to make. The announcement was, let's create a police state. That was their announcement, a police state, and let's crack down on those playgrounds. That was the big aha moment. Not paid sick days, not paid sick leave, not, you know what? Let's get the vaccines to the warehouses and the factories. Let's make sure that, you know, that 97-year-old man in Scarborough who is housebound can get his shot. Let's make sure, you know, that right here in St. Paul's, where there are people who are struggling, who might be 18, who might be 21 or 38 or any age, that have mental health issues and challenges, who need that vaccine. Let's ensure that they can get it. You know, we here in St. Paul's, we're in an interesting situation where only 3 of our postal codes are on the hot zone list, right? But let me say this, even the Ontario Science Table made it clear that they did not just say to the government, go choose these postal codes. That was the government's decision. Because even with this postal code, you know, plan that the government has, people are still falling through the cracks. I have people, you know, in postal codes that aren't on the list, who are essential workers, who are lower income folks, who have mental health challenges, who cannot get a vaccine. Some of them whom are housebound. I was just talking the other day about a constituent who's had her hip surgery postponed several times, her CT scans postponed several times. So there are a lot of people hurting. But what is common in all of this is the developers aren't hurting. The big donors to the Conservative Party aren't hurting. Why is that? So please, when people go to the polls next year, Doug Ford has to go. Has to go. You know, in my opinion, an NDP government would not have had us in this very situation. But the decision is yours, and I respect that. But what we have to know right now is that Doug Ford has to go. Because he's not providing the leadership, he's not providing the transparency, and there was no equity plan. There was no equity plan. There was no iron ring around our seniors. And I'm angry. I am angry. I am pissed off. I'm frustrated. And thank you for your hard work. You know, Reshev, as an essential worker, you know, to the professor, thank you. I have seen, look at what they're doing with Laurentian. Look at how the Ford government has turned their back on Laurentian U. You cannot be given the keys, albeit by 40% of Ontarians, and we could have a whole conversation on our broken electoral system, but you cannot be given the keys sitting in the front seat of the car and just decide, I'm gonna let it drive itself, because it goes off the cliff, and it goes off the cliff with all of us in it. And that is what Doug Ford is doing to our province. He has to go. His time is up. Thank you, Nicholas.
I agree fully on every point you have made in the conversation, and you have made all my arguments for me in the past, so I don't need to reiterate them. But we need change. We dramatically need change in every front. This is a failure of every front of government, and that we who have a universal public healthcare system are in this position when we have universal healthcare public, you know, quasi universal healthcare, because we have so many gaps in it too, that we are here speaks volumes.
Nicholas, can I say a few words about this?
Sure. We're open now, so feel free to chime in, anyone.
So I think that the demands by the NDP and the Labour Movement, the OFL, are commendable. But I think that what is clearly missing is any organized mass action to back up those demands. And I think that the workers' movement in Ontario, across Canada, frankly relies far too much on parliamentary cretinism. That means that basically they are totally averse to mobilizing the ranks of labor in any definitive way to back up these demands. As Jill mentioned, key leaders of the Conservative Party have been campaigning for 10 paid sick days for months. Everyone is on side on this issue. What's stopping it from happening? They think the NDP and the Liberals, but particularly we're talking about the NDP here because they're the Labour Party, that they have nothing to back up their demand. So then the question relies on, well, what are we going to do about it? The days of action were organized against Mike Harris in the mid-90s over a situation which was dire, but not nearly as dire as today's situation. We've lost over 8,000 people in Canada, disproportionately workers, people of color. And what is the labor movement doing? Nothing. I'm on the OPSEU executive board. I'm on in my own union. And I'll tell you that when we have discussions on the board and what's happening, for instance, in the OFL, nothing is happening. The NDP had a plan, a tentative plan for a car caravan, which was supposed to take place during the day of mourning on April 26th. That was canceled. I guess they hoped that maybe Ford was going to come forward with the 10 days, but he didn't. We got 3 instead.
I would just jump in and say that if something has been canceled, which I was not aware of, I would wonder if it had anything to do with COVID protocol, if it had anything to do with gathering publicly, if it had anything to do with the current stay-at-home orders we're under, to not leave the house for essential reasons. I want to say that clearly because I think it is important for audiences to know that when you become a member of provincial parliament, you know, I sit here as a proud, a PSSP member, a QP member myself. There are different tools that you can use when you are a legislator versus when you are, an activist, when you are a person in your union. The hats are similar, but the hats are also a little different. So what we have to do is work together to ensure that the work gets done. And again, I cannot say enough that COVID-19 is pretty crappy. It began last year, but there's been 15 years of organizing, 15 years of working with MPPs that were Liberal government MPPs at the time, and they gave Ontario 2 sick days. I can't get over a cold in 2 sick days. If I stump my toe on my door going out to work, I'm down for the count for at least 4 days. 2 days was crap as well too.
Oh, absolutely.
And if I could also, step in, and I kind of on the backs of what Jill is saying, we also represent our healthcare workers and our healthcare unions and the doctors, the expert tables have been saying to us, although we want to be out on those streets, we want to be there, we want to circle Queen's Park, we want to be screaming at the tops of our lungs out in public, but we know that our healthcare system is already at the brink of collapse. And they're begging us not to. I live near a community where every Saturday they are having these freedom rallies with Derek Sloan and Maxime Bernier, and it is just horrendous. The whole community is in an uproar because we're trying to get a handle on COVID. Our hospital is inundated because we have over 150 patients coming from Toronto up to our hospital. We have tents set out, and so we want to be there. We're trying to use every tool we have in the labor movement and pushing. And one of the things that we are also doing, part of our campaign, is we are educating our members on the 3 rights: the right to know, the right to participate, and the right to refuse unsafe work. And that's what needs to happen. And I know people are calling for mass work refusals, but we also have to be very careful because the work refusal has to be individual. It cannot be initiated by a union or a group of people. It has to be individual. But where we want to support all the workers in doing this and really pushing, because that's what needs to happen. I've seen educational assistants who have refused unsafe work. We need to really help our workers to feel safe to be able to do that and ensure that they have the backing of the labor movement and their union behind them. So we have done amazing work at the OFL, and we'll continue to push and use these tools. And we know we are when we get calls from the Conservatives asking us to stop inundating them with phone calls and emails and so on, because they can't help their constituents. But we know they're not even in their offices. They're not in their offices.
The Tories don't care. I mean, listen, they don't care. And frankly, you know, the argument that we can't launch any mass action because it would be irresponsible for us to ask the nurses to go out on strike, frankly, is a false dichotomy. Nobody's asking nurses or hospital workers to go out on strike. The rest of us can go out. The rest of us can be engaged in mass walkouts. And frankly, the public would be overwhelmingly on our side if we walked out in favor of paid sick days for all workers, non-unionized workers. Enough of the excuses, folks. Yeah, this is, if we're not going to move today on this issue, then it's never going to happen.
Can you imagine all the grocery store workers just walking off the job?
They would.
I have imagined it.
Nothing.
Can you imagine?
Nothing to stop us.
Just walking up.
I think we all have imagined it.
We all have imagined it.
Absolutely.
But what I hear here and what I agree with, I have these conversations with my friends, family, many of whom are essential workers, public sector workers, this, that, and the other. Something bold has to happen. Something big has to happen. And like never before has there been a galvanizing around the issue of paid sick days. Because at the end of the day, if we don't get what we need, people will continue to be killed by COVID. People will continue to die. That is the simple fact.
And I just want to say this last thing, because you know the labor movement was created through illegal actions once upon a time. Unions have massive war chests of money that has been accumulating for decades. If there's any time, I mean, the employer class breaks the law all the time. The right to strike exists in Canada until we use it. They break the law all the time, and you know, we go to court and we win, but it takes us 10 years, and then they do the same things over and over again. Just once, the labor movement should break the law and ask the members of their unions to walk out until we get our demands.
Friends, we have to wrap up this discussion, and I know it's, you know, it is one that is very emotional, and it's close to, I think, all of our hearts. And I'll end by saying this: we've run out of time. Workers in Ontario need permanent sick leave, not the temporary program that was launched, and 3 days is wholly insufficient. So workers need to have at least 10 paid sick leave days so that they could stay home while they're sick. So I want to thank all the panelists, Dr. Jill Andrew, Professor Anna Ainsworth, Julius Arscott, Sister Patty Coates, and Rochev Brown for joining the panel discussion tonight. You're watching Union Matters, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Yes, pleasure to be here.
Happy May Day.
Happy May Day
indeed.
Absolutely. All right, folks.
This is Union Matters with Nicholas Thompson.